오늘도 이른 아침에 이렇게 많이 나와주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 그러면 제가 변희산 영어로 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure you are all aware of the fact that China surpassed the UK and France in terms of its GDP last year. So China is already the fourth largest economy in the world. And the rapid pace of Chinese economic growth is being continued and frequently projected well into the future. So many questions being raised in this regard. But one of the critical questions for us to consider is, what does this mean to the rest of the world, particularly a country like Korea? This morning we are very fortunate to have Professor Richard Cooper from Harvard University, who will share his enlightening views regarding the future Chinese economic performance with us. For most of the economists present here, I don't think I need to have introduction of Professor Richard Cooper. I'm very sure that you met him previously, either in person or at least through his many books and articles. And so most of you must be familiar with him. But for those who have not met him, because you're in a profession, I'll just let you know a few things about Professor Cooper. Professor Cooper currently holds the Emeritus Boyce Professor of International Economics at Harvard University, and he has been leading very, very outstanding career in both academia and in public service. He is one of the most respected economists of today. In fact, I won't be really surprised if Nobel Committee nominate him for the prize. He has long list of the books and articles authored throughout his academic career. And at the same time, he served the U.S. government and the U.S. public institutions in many occasions. He served as chairman of the National Intelligence Council in the 90s, and then he was undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs in the 70s and early 80s. Then also he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Monetary Affairs in the 50s and the early 60s. And also he was senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors in the early 60s. I suppose it's during the Kennedy administration. And also he served as chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston in the 90s. So he had a very distinguished career in public policy making as well. We were talking over the breakfast table. He looks very young. He still has a baby face, but he has a very outstanding experience in both academia and public policy. So I don't think I should waste the time to introduce him. And it's very fortunate to have him this morning. He will share really positive views on China. So please join me in welcoming this.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'd like to say how pleased I am to be here in Seoul in general and in this group in particular. I've known Dr. Sakong for many years now, considered him an old friend. He spent a year in Washington at the Institute for International Economics, with which I'm associated on a part-time basis. And anyway, I'm delighted to be here with you. I do not know how it is in Seoul, although I can imagine from how it is both in the United States, Washington, New York, Boston, London, Paris, Berlin. China is on everyone's mind these days. It is in many ways a remarkable story, at least the last few decades, and people are wondering what the next few decades are going to look like. I note that recently, at least in the United States, China is increasingly paired with India, and the two are treated as sort of non-identical twins. I will comment briefly only on India. The focus of my remarks will be on China, and what I'm going to do for concreteness is focus on the year 2025. That's 2 decades from now. It's far enough away so that small changes from year to year that accumulate can mark significant changes between now and then, and yet not so far away as to be outside our horizon. I dare say most people in this room can remember 20 years ago, and by the same token you can project 20 years forward. 50 years I find beyond my imagination anyway. So my focus is on 20 years, 2025, and I think it's desirable to focus on 2025 quantitatively, both to indicate what are the practical possibilities that will be open to China, and to demythologize statements that suggest large magnitudes, terms like the next economic superpower, without specifying what they are. It sounds awesome, but in fact it's a term that's uninformative until you try to quantify it. Of course, no one really knows what China will look like in 2 decades, and indeed a range of outcomes is possible. Recently, well, late last year, Royal Dutch Shell issued its global scenarios for 2025, and they allow China to grow from anywhere from 6.5% to 8.5% a year during the coming 2 decades, depending on the world economic and political environment. And as we shall see, I'll remark, others would have even lower growth rates. For the sake of concreteness, I'm going to build on the 2025 projections of the U.S. Department of Energy, which projections, as adjusted by me, yield a growth in dollar terms of 7.2% a year over the next 2 decades. These projections will not necessarily be correct, but they have the advantage of representing an internally consistent projection, globally speaking, that is reasonably optimistic about China's growth, as I am, and that ties the growth projections with energy demand, which is one of the important interactions between China and the rest of the world, both in economic and in environmental terms, and I will comment later on the energy dimension. And then we can use this to address the implications of growth and take excursions from this baseline projection. So if one does that, and the adjustment I make is to put the Chinese economy in dollar terms, so concretely that means I allow for 1% real appreciation per year of the RMB relative to the US dollar over the course of the next 2 decades. That is a common, familiar phenomenon for a growing poor country, that its currency appreciates in real terms. And if one does that, Chinese GDP in 2025, measured in today's, which really means last year's, dollars, will reach $8 trillion a year. $8 trillion a year. In that year, it will have exceeded Japan, finally, and become the second largest economy in the world, measured by gross domestic product. It will still, however, be only a little more than a third larger than the U.S. What people forget often when they talk about the future of China is that the United States is also growing during this period of time. And so the U.S. economy will be substantially larger than it is now. China, $8.4 trillion. The U.S. economy will be $22 trillion measured in 2005 dollars during this period of time. China's population will have grown to 1.4 billion, while Japan's population will actually have declined during this period. Japan reached its peak last year and will have declined on U.S. Census Bureau projections to 120 million people. The USA in that year will have an estimated 350 million people, and my guess is that's actually a little on the low side. Now, several observations can be made about these projections. The first is that China will do quite well continue to do very well on these projections over the next 2 decades. Not as rapid as the last few years, but in fact at a rate that is marginally below China's aspiration of doubling GDP per capita every decade. So there will be a quadrupling GDP during this period of time. And part of the reasons for the decline in growth rate have to do with the demographic features of China, to which I'll come back in a moment. In spite of all of this growth, China will remain a relatively poor country, with GDP per capita only about 1/12 that of Japan and of the United States. The gap will be considerably lower in purchasing power parity. I'll come back to that in a moment. But more important, I think, than comparisons with Japan and the United States, the Chinese will be 5 times richer than they were in the year 2000. And all Chinese under the age of 50 will have grown up in a period of rapid economic growth and increasing prosperity. Third, the dynamics of population change is quite different between the United States and China, Japan, Korea, as I understand it, and indeed most East Asian countries. America's population continues to grow during this period of time, although at a somewhat lower rate. We read a lot in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, I dare say in Korea, but you will know better than I, about the aging of society. And that is a perfectly legitimate concern. It has fiscal implications, has many implications. I focus rather at the other end of the labor force, which is the number of young adults coming into the labor force, which I think has as profound implications as the aging of society does for the way our societies function. And here, just for concreteness, I focus on the number of 20 to 24-year-olds, the group that is just leaving its education and entering the labor force. It's the group that is the most educated and the most flexible members of our labor force, both occupationally and geographically, as they enter the labor force. And here one sees that in Japan, this age group is expected to decline at a rate of over 1% a year. for the next 20 years, such that by 2025, the number of 20-year-olds will be only 70% what they are today. China, and this is a surprise to many people who don't know much about China, has the same phenomenon. The numbers are a little different, but the same phenomenon. On U.S. Census Bureau projections, the number of 20-year-olds or young adults in China is expected to decline by 19% between now and 2025, almost 1% a year. And this, I think, has important implications for China. The United States, in contrast, will see the number of young adults continue to rise at a somewhat lower rate than in the last 2 decades, but nonetheless continue to rise, and the actual rise will depend, among other things, of course, on immigration. It's worth noting here as a digression, but it's relevant to these comparisons, that the United States is unique among rich countries of the world in its demographics. We've seen a crash of natality, of birth rates, in all the rich countries of the world, and including many middle-income countries like Korea. Korea has had, I don't have to tell you, a very sharp drop in natality. Eastern Europe, as well as Western Europe, and China, the only really poor country that's in this group, partly due to the one-child policy that was introduced in 1980, 1979, but partly due to other changes that are taking place in China. And the United States, while there has been some decline in the birth rate in the United States, it has not been nearly as dramatic as in other rich countries. And of course, the United States is continually refreshed by immigration, and the immigration tends to be concentrated in young adults. So just this group that is the most flexible element of the labor force. So the U.S. stands out in marked contrast to other countries, other rich countries, but including in this category, China. I already mentioned that China would be a little more than a third the size of the United States, but that's a very big GDP, 8.4 billion. It is, if you make allowance for the differences in pricing measurements, about the same size as the USA was in 1993, a little more than a decade ago. And therefore, if it is able to tax effectively, and that continues to be an important if in China, then it will have much scope for playing on the international field, whether it's in terms of military expenditures or foreign aid or foreign investment, what have you. Now, one sometimes sees much larger numbers than the ones I've just given to you, and indeed suggestions that the U.S. economy could be larger than the United States by 2025. These presentations compare GDPs using so-called purchasing power parity conversion rates rather than market exchange rates. PPP, purchasing power parity, is actually a necessary concept in comparing standards of living across in different countries, since an important part of every family's expenditures is on locally produced goods and services, especially labor services, and these are much cheaper in poor countries than they are in rich countries, reflecting lower overall productivity. And in terms of PPP, China's GDP in 2002 was 4.6 times larger than it was at market exchange rates, measured in dollars, and already 70% bigger than Japan's economy, whereas at market exchange rates, Japan's GDP was nearly 4 times bigger than that of China. So this choice of these units of measurement actually makes a big difference. This is, I know, a somewhat technical point, but it is, I think, a vitally important point, because I believe that PPP has come to be grossly misused, particularly by the American national security community. I think there are 2 serious problems with using PPP to calculate GDP. The first is conceptual. I won't go into the technical details, I'll just state my views. The first is conceptual. It's just a conceptual mistake to calculate GDP and PPP for any economy that is or is close to being a market economy. In a market economy, all of the prices for goods and services, including factors of production, are linked through market exchanges and through the notion of opportunity cost. It's at market exchange rates that the country engages with the rest of the world. Trade, investment, all take place at market exchange rates. And I think it's just a mistake. We do not compute national GDPs using the concept of purchasing power parity. We shouldn't do it in making international comparisons either. Some these days argue that the RMB is undervalued by as much as 25%, but as I indicated, I've actually allowed in my figures for an appreciation over this period of time of more than 25%. But there's a huge difference between an appreciation of 25% and an appreciation of 450%. It's the second I'm arguing against. The second argument against PPP is practical. The Chinese PPP exchange rate is based on a single, fragile U.S.-China price comparison made in the mid-1980s, that's already 20 years ago, for roughly 300 goods and services, some of which involved heroic assumptions to make the U.S. good or service comparable to the Chinese good or service at the time. So the numbers that are used, including the numbers reported by the World Bank, are, in my judgment, just made of sand. They are not substantial numbers. So, in any case, for geopolitical or geoeconomic purposes, it's market exchange rates that provide the relevant basis for comparing market economies. And as I've already suggested, the choice actually makes a big difference. China is already nearly twice the size of the Japanese economy using PPP, but in fact, that's not relevant for most of the things that we're interested in. I've been talking like an economist, but China demonstrated the importance of market exchange rates even in the military arena when it purchased military aircraft and ships, naval vessels from Russia at Russia's export prices, despite a known strong preference for producing military equipment at home in China. In effect, China was indicating that it could not produce comparable weapons at a competitive cost domestically. So there's a tremendous amount of information about the Chinese economy and Chinese assessment of their economy in those purchases of Russian military equipment. Now, a larger China, of course, has implications for the world economy. Demand for food, energy, other resources will be much higher. By the same token, the supply of manufacturers and other goods and services by China to the rest of the world will also be much higher. Of special interest to Korea, indeed to the world, will be China's demand for energy, especially coal, with its tendency to pollute and produce acid rain, and oil with its limited domestic supply in China. On the Department of Energy projections, China's total demand for energy will grow at a rate of about 4% a year to 2025, as opposed to 1.3% a year in the United States and 0.7% a year in Japan. These projected growth rates allow for continued increases in energy efficiency. They do not just project forward today's use of energy. They assume roughly a 1%, a little more than 1% increase in energy efficiency per year in the coming 2 decades, but no great breakthrough in the use of energy. So it's business changing as usual, so to speak. By 2025, China will be consuming about 14 million barrels a day of oil, over twice Japan's consumption in that year, and a little bit over half the consumption of the United States. Coal consumption, mainly to generate electricity, will more than double to 2.8 billion tons a year, with important implications for air pollution and acid rain, absent drastic improvements in the way that coal is consumed in China, and implications for the emission of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, an important greenhouse gas. China will also have a great demand for infrastructure of all kinds: power, transport, housing, urban services, as the country becomes much more urbanized than it is today. With a further quadrupling of China's GDP, the composition of both output and demand will, of course, change significantly. The share of agriculture in output and employment will continue to decline, and that of manufacturing and services especially will rise. Manufacturing will move into more technologically sophisticated products as large numbers of trained engineers enter the labor force. One of the many remarkable features of China in recent years is a quadrupling of the number of college students over the last decade. I cannot address, and indeed am puzzled about, the quality of the new graduates, how one can expand the system of higher education as rapidly as, in fact, the Chinese have expanded it, and at the same time maintain quality, is something that we would all like to know about. Part of the answer may be that they have not maintained quality. We won't know until a few years' time as these graduates come into the labor force and are absorbed. Exports of manufactured goods will continue to rise, although it's at a slower rate as Chinese products encounter increasing market resistance and as poorer countries compete with increasing success at producing at the low skill end of labor-intensive products. There will be more intensive competition in the U.S. market, indeed in most markets, for Chinese products that require much labor and assembly, for example in household appliances and perhaps even automobiles. This competition will meet some selective resistance, but in the end I think it will be accepted. Along with the growth in Chinese exports are rapidly growing imports, and by 2025 Chinese imports will amount to perhaps $1.5 trillion, far greater than Japan's, and indeed greater than Europe's imports from non-European countries, that is to say extra-European imports. So China will be the second largest importing region in the world, counting the European Union as a single region. It will be about half the imports into the U.S., but about the same magnitude as imports in the US, into the U.S. today, and that will make China a major market for the products of many countries and give the world a tremendous interest in both the prospects of the Chinese economy and in Chinese foreign trade policy during this time. China's transition for full compliance with WTO rules ends at the end of this year. You may remember China entered the WTO in 2001, and a 5-year, I think a relatively short, transition period to come into full compliance, and that period ends at this year. Compliance is not in fact likely to be complete by the end of this year, since many commitments actually run strongly against well-established Chinese practices, and Beijing is unable to control the entire country except on a few issues of the highest priority. But compliance will, I think, gradually take hold in the coming decades, and by 2025 China is likely to be much more transparent and much more rule-bound than it is today, at least in the area of commercial activity. Furthermore, foreign businessmen will play a significant role in that transformation, and not incidentally will provide an important source of information to the central government, independent of official channels, on what is happening around the country. The age-old problem of the imperial court in Beijing, including the current imperial court, the Politburo of the Communist Party, has been how to get accurate information from the provinces, because officials are known to lie in their own interest. And in in your country and mine, the press, much as I actually dislike the press plays an extremely important role as a non-official source of information, sometimes misinformation, anyways, a source of information to senior officials. For their own reasons, the Chinese are reluctant to encourage a truly free press, but they will find, at least in the commercial arena, in foreign businessmen who complain when the rules are not obeyed, a source of information about what's actually happening out there in the countryside, and will be able to discipline provincial and city officials if they're deviating too grossly from the rules. By 2025, I assume that not only will the Doha round have been completed, but that it will be in the distant past, and the 10-year transition period that typically follows the completion of a multilateral round will have concluded. So the trading world of 2025 will be governed actually by the outcome of the Doha round. We may have entered another round by then, but because of the long time election, what we're negotiating in the Doha round today is the world trading regime for the mid-2020s, after allowing for the transition period. If the aspirations of APEC of several years ago are realized, the target date recalled was 2020, world trade will be completely free of tariffs and other restrictions on imports, and the discriminatory features of any preferential trading arrangements which are currently proliferating rapidly. We were discussing at our table the negotiations between Korea and the United States on a so-called free trade area. I prefer to call them preferential trading arrangements. Anyway, they will be obliterated if the aspiration of APEC is actually realized by 2020. In general, China has played a conservative, low-key role in international economic organizations, and that's likely to continue because the evolving status quo has actually served China's interests very well. All of the above that I've said assumes that China stays on something like its current growth path, which in turn assumes continued peace and prosperity in the world so that trade can can grow unimpeded. Even so, China's internal requirements are formidable. It must grow private sectors enough to compensate for declining employment in the state enterprise sector. It needs to close many loss-making enterprises, has to create a social safety net, a role that historically was played by the state enterprises. It has to deal with the rapid growth in demand for water, waste disposal, new housing in urban areas. It must greatly improve agricultural productivity, partly through large and more efficient irrigation projects, partly through improved seeds and techniques of farming, and it must address the widening income disparities, both regional and sectoral, in part through significant investments in infrastructure within and to the central and western parts of the country. A team at the RAND Corporation, responding to a request several years ago by the U.S. Defense Department, produced in 2003 a study of various adverse scenarios, along with their estimates of their negative impact on Chinese growth between the time of the study and 2015. The possible adversities that they identified cover socially disruptive increase in unemployment, increased corruption, a major epidemic focused on AIDS. This study was actually done before SARS. Failure to solve the emerging shortage of water in northern China, major disruption in world oil supplies, a domestic financial crisis, a sharp decline in inward direct foreign investment, and a military conflict over Taiwan or elsewhere. Others are imaginable, such as a severe world recession or a significant reversion to protectionism in the USA and Europe, neither of which is likely in my view, but both of which are possible. Each of these adversities that was identified has an adverse impact on China's growth ranging from 0.5% to 2.5% a year, on the assumptions made in the study, lowering China's GDP by anywhere from 3 to 24% by 2015, from an unspecified baseline, and we're dealing with increments, decrements. As I've said, continued rapid growth in China requires peace and prosperity in the rest of the world. China thrives on a benign international environment, and China's current leaders understand that well. Legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party depends on delivering economic prosperity at home, as does a peaceful rise of China in the Society of Nations. But China will have at least 2 sets of new leaders by 2025. If the leaders of 2025 are around age 60, they will have been born around 1965, reached college age in the radically different environment of 1985. Their parents will have been the victims, or in a few cases the perpetrators, of the Cultural Revolution. Political evolution in China is likely to proceed slowly. Current leaders and their likely successors will remain preoccupied with maintaining political and social stability and the political monopoly of the admittedly much transformed Communist Party. They see an opening up to free discourse, for example through a truly free press and contested elections, as potentially unleashing destabilizing forces. Yet increased democratization is part of their program. In fact, it runs through the literature of the Communist Party literature, the need to democratize. They're likely to experiment with a variety of techniques for holding officials more accountable to the local populace, and some of this may actually involve carefully constrained and monitored elections, as in many villages today. If these experiments are successful, they may be gradually extended in scope. The notional model is likely to be Singapore, where the forms of Western democracy have been introduced, but where in fact a single paternalistic party has governed with wide public acceptance for 40 years. Latent nationalism in China is very high, and indeed is fostered by the educational system. Not only are Chinese taught that Taiwan and the South China Sea have been part of China for centuries, regardless of the views of the 23 million people who live on Taiwan, but they are raised to believe that China has suffered terrible humiliations and indignities at the hands of the Europeans and Japanese, with Americans thrown in for good measure, for the century ending in 1949, when China stood up. These factors are reflected in middle school textbooks, which is the only history that most Chinese ever get, is in middle school, which still today distort history through selective omissions and through the use of tendentious, colorful adjectives. I'll just give 2 examples. One is, as far as the Chinese textbooks are concerned, the Chinese never had a meeting with the British in the 19th century. They only had humiliating meetings with the British in the 19th century. And on the question of the Korean War, there is 4 or 5 pages on the Korean War. They, of course, extol the heroic performance of Chinese soldiers in the Korean War. That's par for the course in all national textbooks. But they managed to discuss in 5 pages the Korean War without ever mentioning that in June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. They leave the impression, without saying so, that the United States started the war. And I know that that's the impression that they wanted to leave, because we have many Chinese students and big visiting faculty come through Cambridge. I take the occasion to ask them what they know about the Korean War, and they all just take it for granted, A, that America started it, but that's in the distant past. We're not very interested in it. So, but this is a critical omission of a salient fact, and that's salient in my mind because I remember personally June 25th, 1950, when North Korea invaded the South. I was living in Germany at the time, and we thought the Russians were coming the next day, invading northwestern Germany from eastern Germany. They did not do so. And this pattern runs through the Chinese text: selective omission of what I, at any rate, think are critical facts in comprehending a historical event, and the use of colorful adjectives. This is not educational policy of the 60s or 70s. This is educational policy of the early 21st century. And I think foreigners need to ask what is going on here. It could be just a disconnect in Chinese policy. Everyone who knows anything about government knows that disconnects happen, particularly when they involve different ministries. Or it could involve the Chinese authorities deliberately playing a different hand domestically than they are playing internationally. One can imagine scenarios under which the internal obstacles slow Chinese growth and violate high expectations of the Chinese public, leading to domestic unrest that threaten the Communist Party regime. Contemporary leaders might then trump up external factors, perhaps even provoking them to arouse the latent nationalism in order to rally support for a regime to stand up to the external threats, in quotes, or indignities. Japan is the most likely to be the target of such built-up threats or indignities, but it could also involve the United States, or Russia, or even India. Russia and Japan are the traditional adversaries of China. Problems with the USA arise over Taiwan and the general American influence in the Western Pacific. Such a turn of events would seriously damage China's economic prospects, since foreign investment and even foreign markets would be put at risk. Sensible leaders will thus be very cautious about unleashing Chinese nationalism, but that is no guarantee that it will not occur. Germany in 1914 and Argentina in 1982, to take only two examples, took on external adversaries in ways that were clearly not in the country's economic interests. The fourth of Deng Xiaoping's four modernizations was to modernize the People's Liberation Army. Anomalously, the PLA is still an instrument of the Communist Party. It is also an instrument of the state, but it started out and remains an instrument of the Communist Party, and it reports mainly to the CCP, to the Communist Party. In the early 1980s, the PLA was huge in manpower, archaic in equipment, doctrine, and training. China has greatly reduced its size, although it remains the largest military in the world in terms of manpower, and plans further reductions. It has acquired more modern weaponry from Russia, especially for the Navy and Air Force, although with technology of the 1970s, that weaponry is still well behind the frontier of modern weaponry. The primary task of the PLA is still to preserve internal stability in China, although that assignment formally now lies with the People's Armed Police, not with the PLA. The PLA, like militaries around the world, has been a close student of recent military conflicts in the Middle East, in Iraq, and in Kosovo, and it recognizes the need to change its structure and doctrine in order to be able to fight a high-tech war, but it remains a long distance from achieving the transformation. Presumably, by 2025, we will have made this transformation. China in recent years has settled its numerous border disputes, including even the dispute with India, although that has not been given wide publicity or official recognition, but I'm told that the deal has been worked out. It's just that neither country is willing yet to put it before its parliament. It still has unresolved territorial disputes at sea with Japan to the east and with several Southeast Asian countries in the South China Sea, although it is proposed in the latter case to exploit potential undersea resources cooperatively without formally resolving the territorial disputes. Its strategic aim is to control the seas around China, especially the Strait of Taiwan. Its military aim is to be able to act quickly if necessary to a provocation by Taiwan and to keep the U.S. 7th Fleet and other forces at bay with threats from missiles and submarines. None of this is surprising. Military modernization is thus on the agenda, and the PLA commands a growing defense budget, but this is an economy that's growing rapidly, and I have the impression that it is not the top priority of the current leaders, and that it is being pursued diligently, but without a sense of urgency. As China grows, its dependence on imported materials will grow. China has ample coal and is rich in some other minerals, but in general it is not a resource-rich country, and has already become dependent on imports of iron ore to feed its voracious demand of steel, of copper, and especially of oil, where domestic exploration has so far produced only disappointing results. It is also a large absorber of foreign technology, and so far has demonstrated only limited capacity to generate new indigenous technology, although that may change with the large increase in college graduates combined with greater incentives and fewer inhibitions to think creatively than has characterized China in the past. It's another major challenge to the Chinese leaders. The growing dependence on critical imported materials creates new vulnerabilities for China. The clearest and most notable concerns oil. As I've mentioned, on the U.S. Department of Energy's baseline projection, China will consume about 14 million barrels of oil a day in 2025, up from 4.8 million barrels a day consumed in the year 2000. And as recently as 1993, China was a small exporter of oil. By 2025, it will import nearly 11 million barrels a day. China also desires to increase its consumption of natural gas, including LNG, for environmental reasons, to replace coal in the home and workplace, and even to generate electricity in places close to the coast and far from coal mines. Chinese leaders are, of course, aware of this growing dependence and the vulnerabilities it creates, both to physical and to market disruption. China has aggressively pursued oil exploration around the world, with a strong emphasis where possible on equity oil. It's engaged with Iran and Sudan, has had discussions with Russia, Venezuela, Canada, Angola, and indeed many countries. China's oil firms have invested in Canadian tar sands and are building a pipeline to the Pacific coast. They have also built a pipeline from Kazakhstan to western China, and which opened in December of last year and carries about 200,000 barrels a day of oil, and has expressed interest in building one from Russia to mitigate its growing dependence on oil imported by sea. Also plans to create an oil stockpile. At the end of the day, practical considerations of high dependence on imports of critical materials, especially but not only oil, combined with a navy of limited capacity and no naval tradition since the 15th century, are likely to shape Chinese behavior in the international arena in a peaceful and indeed even a strongly cooperative spirit. Concretely, China has the same interest as Korea and the United States in a stable Persian Gulf region from which most of the world's incremental oil must come over the next 20 years. In spite of vigorous programs to build up nuclear energy, hydropower, LNG, I've already mentioned, even wind power in Inner Mongolia, China's demand for electricity is growing so rapidly that China is expected to build in the next 2 decades more coal-fired power plants than the United States and Europe put together. So while the share of coal is going down, the absolute level of consumption of coal is expected to rise very significantly. Anyone interested in either acid rain, as Korea might well be, or global climate change has a tremendous interest in the character of these plants. China is where the action is, not in Europe, not in Japan, not in the United States, on global climate change. Once these plants are built, they will last for half a century. And it is much easier to build in the capacity to capture, sequester carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas than it is to retrofit power plants to do that. So I see a natural area of cooperation, especially between the United States and China, the U.S. providing the technology and the funding with some help from other rich countries, and China providing the experimental field, so to speak. Just because it's building so many power plants, we do not know yet which technique will be the most effective technically and the most economic. A lot of work has been done in the laboratory, very little in the field when it comes to carbon sequestration. This, it seems to me, is high on the agenda of potential cooperation. An alternative scenario to this relatively happy one that I've projected is possible, although I think implausible. Like Germany before 1914, and again in 1941 when it invaded the Soviet Union, and like Japan in the 1930s, China's sense of vulnerability regarding critical materials might lead to an aggressive policy of gaining control over such materials. In China's case, that points mainly to East Siberia, lightly populated and defended by Russia, or to acquisition, probably through sponsored political coups in Southeast Asia, leading to governments that are in effect satellites of Beijing. Although it has to be said that absent significant new discoveries of oil, either in eastern Siberia or in Southeast Asia, those actions by themselves would not be sufficient to assure enough oil for China's needs. In the long run, China might attempt to build a blue water navy and collateral air support capable of challenging the U.S. Navy, not only in the Western Pacific but also in the Indian Ocean, as Japan did with brief but transitory success in the 1930s. But that would require expenditure of tens of billions of dollars and require several decades of construction and naval training to build a modern navy. China is more likely to consider these less attractive alternatives the more hostile is the political environment in which it must operate. So those, and this is especially addressed to, not to you in Korea, but to the national security community in Washington, those who see China as a threat and act accordingly may well be making it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Thank you very much.